الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على عبد الله ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So what we want to do inshallah is to continue where we left off yesterday. And where we left off yesterday is we had started this taster session for ilm al-aqeedati wa usul al-din. Aqeedah and the fundamentals of the religion. But we didn't take the book yet. If you remember rightly, we did like an introduction or a madkhal. We talked about what is Aqeedah, lughatan wa istilahan and everything. But we didn't really get into the book itself. So we said the last thing we finished with yesterday is a very brief discussion of the author, who is Imam Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal al-Shaybani, rahimahullah ta'ala rahmatan wasi'ah. And we spoke about Imam Ahmad very briefly. Imam Ahmad wrote a book called Usul al-Sunnah. And this book is a very summarized, very summarized book of Aqeedah. Now, books of Aqeedah could be divided into two types. If you want to, you can talk about Aqeedatun Amma, general Aqeedah. What do we mean by general Aqeedah? It's going to cover a belief about Allah, His messengers, the angels, the scripture, the last day, the divine decree, what we believe about the Sahaba, what the issues of rulership and authority, and all of that, generally speaking. And some other books you could categorize as, you could call them Kutub al-Tawheed, the books that deal specifically with Tawheed alone, yani al-Imanu billah. They deal with belief in Allah by itself. So there are many books that were authored just like that. They deal with al-Iman billah. Or they deal with al-Uluhiyyah specifically, ibadatullah, worshipping Allah, and what does it mean to worship Him and not make a partner with Him. But this book is Aqeedah Amma. It's a very generic, general book. It covers lots of points. And we wouldn't say that it's comprehensive. Imam Ahmad didn't mention every single point that is made up, or that Aqeedah is made up of, but he mentioned many of them in 50 bullet points. So he made 50 little bullet points as a reminder for us about what our Aqeedah is based upon, what our belief is based upon. Now, what I want you to think about is, don't forget what we spoke about yesterday, in the sense of why these issues are mentioned. We talked about the different groups that came about in the early days of Islam, and how the Ummah broke up after the time of the Sahaba into different groups and sects, and why each one of them would be, what they would be focused upon. So bear that in mind as we go through the book. Now, because there are 50 points and we only have about an hour, I'm definitely not going to go into details on every point, but I am going to go into details in some of them, inshallah. So we'll try to read all of them, and we'll try to go into details in some of them. The same as what we did for the book of Sheikh Salih al-Usaymi, hafidhahullah ta'ala, in the last session, where we read every heading, but we didn't go into detail in all of them. We'll choose some of them. So this narration from one of the students of Imam Ahmad, he said, سمعت أبا عبد الله أحمد بن محمد بن حنبل رضي الله عنه يقول أصول السنة عندنا. He said, I heard Abu Abdullah Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Hanbal. Here he says radiyallahu anhu. Normally we only say radiyallahu anhu for the Sahaba. However, there's nothing wrong with saying it for someone who came after the time of the Sahaba. It's just not the common thing to do. You find it in some books. You found him say, the usul of the Sunnah, usul al-Sunnah. What type of Sunnah does he mean here? By Sunnah here he means Aqeedah, right? He's not talking about Hadith. He's not talking about Mustalah al-Hadith, what's Sahih, what's Da'if. He's talking about Aqeedah. The foundations of Aqeedah for us. Now bear in mind, did Imam Ahmad see all of the groups that came about? He didn't see all of them, right? Does that make sense? He didn't see every single group that we have today, but he's focusing on the issues that were in his time and before his time, and he's focusing on some of them, not all of them. The first point that he mentions, التمسك بما كان عليه أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والاقتداء بهم. This is the most important point he mentions in the Risala. It's the most important point, and it's the most generic of all of them, and that is holding on to what the Sahaba were upon and taking the guidance of the Sahaba as our guidance. I don't think any of us doubt that in Islam we have to follow the Quran and the Sunnah. I think all of us agree upon that. And generally most of the tawa'if, the different groups, there are some exceptions, but most of them agreed upon that. They said, we agree that a Muslim has to follow the Quran and the Sunnah. No doubt there were some groups who came and rejected the Sunnah completely, like the Shia or the Ghulat al-Shia, the extreme Shia. They came and they said, we don't take any of the Sunnah. So did the people who call themselves the Quraniyun, even though that name is not a good name for them. They also came and said, we don't accept anything in the Sunnah. Also the extreme Ghulat al-Khawarij, the extreme Khawarij also, they came and said, we don't accept what is in the Sunnah, we only accept what is in the Quran. But the majority of the groups, they said, no, we accept the Quran and the Sunnah. So if all of us agreed upon the Quran and the Sunnah, what is it that makes us different? How can we be separate from them? Is there a guidance from the Prophet ﷺ about what makes us and them different? Didn't the Prophet ﷺ say, وَسَتَفْتَرِقُ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ إِلَى 73 فِرْقَةٍ. This ummah will break up into 73 groups. Okay, most of those groups agree with the Quran and Sunnah. What makes you different from them? مَنْ كَانَ عَلَى مِثْلِ مَا أَنَا عَلَيْهِ الْيَوْمِ وَأَصْحَابِي. What me and my companions are upon. That's why in the hadith of Al-Irbad ibn Sariya, the famous hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ gave a farewell speech to the Sahaba, what did he say? فَإِنَّهُ مَنْ يَعِشْ مِنْكُمْ فَسَيَرَى اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Whoever of you lives a long time is going to see lots of ikhtilaf. Is that not the time? Is that not the time we're in today? Do we not look around and we see ikhtilaf? Ikhtilaf in aqeedah, ikhtilaf in fiqh, ikhtilaf in al-manhaj, the way we do things. We see ikhtilafat kathira, we see so much. What's the advice? فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِسُنَّتِي. Stick to my sunnah. Okay, but a lot of people are trying to do that. وَسُنَّةِ الْخُلَفَاءِ الرَّاشِدِينَ الْمَهْدِيِّينَ. And the sunnah of the Sahaba. The Khulafa al-Rashidin, Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiyallahu anhum. So now that tells us that this is what makes us different from the other people. Is this also proven in the Quran? It is. We'll just give one ayah, but there are many. But to keep our discussion short, we'll give one ayah. فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ فَقَدْ اهْتَدَوْا وَإِنْ تَوَلَّوْا فَإِنَّمَا هُمْ فِي شِقَاقٍ. If the new people to Islam believe, كَمَا آمَنْتُمْ. Amantum, it is a group of people, not the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If it's the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it would be فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا آمَنْتَ بِهِ آمَنْتُمْ أَيُّهَا الصَّحَابَةِ. If the new people believe like you Sahaba believe, they are guided. And if they turn away from what you Sahaba believe, فَإِنَّمَا هُمْ فِي شِقَاقٍ. They are opposing the Sunnah. They're going against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there are other ayat in the Quran that indicate that we have to take the belief of the Sahaba. Wallahi, this one thing can be for you the measurement between al-haq wal-batil, the truth and the falsehood. Any group that comes, you bring that group. Any group. Today, groups come. By the time we finish this discussion, maybe one new group came. Groups come like this, they come and go, they break and they fall apart and they form and they go away again. Any group that comes to you, whatever name they give you, you can take that group and say, where does that group stand with regard to the Quran? Okay, Quran, they take the Quran properly. They're not twisting the words or disbelieving in parts of the Quran. They believe in the whole Quran. So some people, we can take them out from that. The Batiniyya and the people who said, Salah doesn't mean Salah and Zakah doesn't mean Zakah and all of that. We can take those people out. After the Quran, we go to the Sunnah. Do they believe in the Sunnah? وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوا وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. Whatever the messenger gives you, take it. Whatever he holds you back from, keep away from it. If they take the Quran and the Sunnah, all of the Sunnah, not selective Sunnah, not like we take the Sunnah we like and we leave the Sunnah we don't. They take all the Sunnah, then we ask, where are you with regard to the Sahaba? If you people believe like Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiyallahu anhum, and you take their belief and you hold on to it and you love it and you promote it, you belong among Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And the Sunnah here is the Prophet ﷺ, and the Jama'ah here is the Sahaba and those who followed them in good. And what the Sahaba agreed upon and those who followed them in good. So this is from the most important points of our Aqeedah. And that is holding on to the Sahaba. That's why if you ask us to name our belief, do you belong to this group or do you belong to this group or do you belong to this one? Do you belong among these people or those people? We attribute ourselves to Islam, to the Sahaba, to the early generations, and the people who were the early generations and the people who held on to the Sunnah. That's why from the names of Ahlus Sunnah is, they call them Ahlus Sunnah. Ahlus Sunnah meaning the people who stuck to what the Prophet ﷺ was upon. And they call them Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah, the people who stuck to the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba and those who followed them in good. And sometimes they use the word, the people who follow the way of the Salaf, and the Salaf are the Sahaba, and those who follow them and those who follow them. خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. And sometimes they use the word Ahlul Hadith, and the people who hold on to the Hadith. They don't hold on to any one Sheikh, but they hold on to the Hadith and they take their belief from the Hadith. And Ahlul Athar, the people who hold on to the narrations and so on. And Al-Athar are what came from the Prophet ﷺ and from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. So if you look at it, all of this is going back to what? The Quran, the Sunnah and the Sahaba. And that's why it is not obligatory to use any one of those names. Does that make sense? It's not obligatory, it's not wajib that you have to call yourself Ahlul Hadith or Ashabul Hadith. It's not obligatory. But it is obligatory that you follow that wasf, that description. The Quran, the Sunnah, the Sahaba and those who followed them in good, who are included within the Hadith, خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم. That is obligatory upon you. You have to follow them and you have to be upon that. And anyone who goes against that has left the way of the Prophet ﷺ. But as for labels and names, there's a principle we have in fiqh. Al-asma'u la tughayyiru al-haqa'iq. Names don't change the reality of things. For example, if a person took a glass of water and they wrote on this glass of water, vodka, does it change it being water? Doesn't. We might say, Akhi, what are you doing? Ittaqillah, why are you writing those things? But it doesn't change. Water is water. And if you took a bottle of wine and you removed the label and wrote grape juice, it doesn't change the reality of it being haram. So it's not the name that bothers us, but it's the reality. And the reality has to be the Kitab and the Sunnah and what the Sahaba came together upon and those who followed them in good. Does that include the 4 Imams? It does. Because if you look at their Aqeedah, by and large, with a few points here and there, كُلٌّ يُؤْخَذْ مِنْ قَوْلِهِ وَيُرَدْ, everyone gets things right and wrong. But if we generally look at their Aqeedah, we look at what was preserved from the Aqeedah of Abu Hanifa and Malik and Shafi'i and Ahmad, we find that all of it is in agreement with that. And that's what they call to. That's what they call to. They call to the Quran and the Sunnah and what the Sahaba were upon. Even if in individual issues a person can get something wrong and a person can get something right. But in general, that is what the Imams of Islam called to. Don't confuse Aqeedah and fiqh. Don't say that Muhammad Tim says you cannot be Shafi'i or you cannot be Hanbali or Hanafi. This is a fiqh issue. We're talking now about where do you take your belief from? Belief in Allah, the angels, the messengers, the scripture, the last day, qadr, belief about the Sahaba. This is what we're talking about now. We're not talking about whether you put your hands on your chest or you put your hands on your stomach or you put your hands by your sides. There's a right and a wrong answer for that. I'm not saying it's not. There's a right way and a wrong way. But that is not what we're talking about here. It's not our subject, our topic. Our topic is your belief. And the belief of those Imams was one belief. In general, with some issues here and there, which is normal, you will have. And there is a right and a wrong. But in general, what they called to was that statement, the Quran and the Sunnah, and what the Sahaba were upon. The second point that the Imam, he mentions, Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, وَتَرْكُ الْبِدَعِ وَكُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ فَهِيَ ضَلَالَةٍ. He said, leaving off bid'ah. First of all, what is bid'ah in the language? You have to know what it is in the language, because otherwise it becomes confusing later on. In the language it means مَا فُعِلَ عَلَى غَيْرِ مِثَالٍ سَابِقٍ. It is something that is done without a previous example, without a previous precedent, we would say. It was done without, something somebody did that doesn't have anyone who did it before. This is called in the language bid'ah. Like in the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, قُلْ مَا كُنْتُ بِدَعًا مِنَ الرُّسُلِ. Say, I am not bid'an, I'm not someone who brought something new among the prophets. What I'm bringing to you, it has mithalun sabiq. It has an example before. From Isa, from Musa, from Ibrahim and Nuh alayhimus salatu wassalam and the prophets and messengers. I'm not bringing you something which has never been done before. Does that make sense? But in the Sharia, there are a lot of discussion back and forward and back and forward. But from the best of the easy definitions, I like the definition of Ibn Rajab, rahimahullah ta'ala. He said, كُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ وَالْمُرَادُ بِالْبِدْعَةِ مَا أُحْدِثَ مِمَّا لَا أَصْلَ لَهُ فِي الشَّرِيعَةِ يَدُلُّ عَلَيْهِ. I like what he said because it's easy to understand. There's issues and you can go back and forward, but we don't have so much time for that. But I like what he said because it's easy to understand. He said every bid'ah is misguidance. What do we mean by it? We mean something which is newly introduced into the religion, which does not have an evidence for it in the Sharia. Now, there's a couple of things we want to take here. First of all, we are talking about the religion. We're not talking about the worldly life. Does that make sense? So we're not talking about mobile phones and computers and microphones. We're not talking about matters of the worldly life of this world. We're talking about religious beliefs and practices. They might be beliefs. They might be practices, actions. Something that has been newly added into the Sharia for which the Sharia does not provide an evidence. Now this is very precise what Ibn Rajab said. He said for which the Sharia does not provide an evidence. Is it correct to say, or what is the problem? I'm going to ask you a question. What's the problem if someone says, bid'ah is doing something the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do? What's the problem with that definition? Listen to what Ibn Rajab said and listen to what I said. For the second one, Ibn Rajab, he said, doing something that doesn't have an evidence in the Sharia. What would be the problem if you said doing something the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do? Yes, Habib. Leave the computers and phones, you're right, but that's all about the matters of the dunya. Leave that. We're talking about religious practices. You think about you're on the right track. Isn't it possible that there is something the Prophet ﷺ didn't do, but there is an evidence for it in the Sharia? It is possible. For example, what about Jam' al-Mushaf, bringing the Mushaf together? What about, for example, what about the Taraweeh, bringing all the people behind one Imam? Is it the case that all of the Sahaba prayed behind the Prophet ﷺ in Taraweeh? Did the Prophet ﷺ indicate that Taraweeh is a good thing? He did. So it was an example of something he didn't do it in his life. He did it for 3 days, but the Sahaba as a whole, but he told the people to do it and he encouraged the people to do it. Why didn't he do it? For a reason that was fear of it becoming obligatory. He didn't want it to become wajib upon the people, so he left it, but he encouraged the Sahaba. So when Umar said, what an excellent bid'ah this is it bid'atun shar'iyya or bid'atun lughawiyya? Is it in the language or the sharia? It has to be in the language, because the very thing that Umar said is a bid'ah is something the Prophet ﷺ did and encouraged to do. Therefore, it's very precise what Ibn Rajab said. If it has a daleel in the sharia, it doesn't come under bid'ah. Even whether the Prophet ﷺ did it, which is the majority, or whether he just told you to do it. Because maybe he told you to do it, but he didn't do it for a particular reason that was with him. For example, in the Hajj, the Prophet ﷺ didn't do all of the types of Hajj, right? He didn't do every single type of variation of Hajj, but he allowed the Sahaba to do it and he encouraged them to do it, and he intended, if I do Hajj again, I would do it like this. For all of this indicates that what matters is that there is an evidence in the Sharia that allows that action. But someone who brings in something that doesn't have an evidence in the Sharia that allows it, this is dalala, it's misguidance. And it's not correct to say that it is hasana, or that it's good, or that there are some kind of good types. Like Imam Ahmad said, our aqeedah is that all of it is misguidance if it comes under bid'ah.